I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We're in lesson 9 this morning, the Christian's attitude towards secular work. Last week we discussed the Christian and how they are to view work, and that we are to view work as honorable. We are not to view work as something that we just hate to do because we're lazy. Now, there might be jobs we don't like to do. That's a given. There are some times I don't like to do housework that much, but it's work that I have to do in order to keep my house clean. I sometimes don't like doing other jobs. Before I lived in a condo, didn't like to go out and mow the grass. Didn't like to go out and shovel the snow. That's work. That's not paid work, but it's work. And sometimes we can find ourselves in jobs we don't like to do. But the Christian is to deem work as honorable, and we are to work the best we can. We are not to we are not in our jobs to just go about and try just to get by. We're to try to do whatever job we're given to do to the best of our abilities. Sometimes we might be treated poorly by our coworkers and our boss, but that doesn't give us the right to not do the best that we are supposed to do. So we're now down to point number 2, which on lesson 9, for those who have our books, the Christian is to participate in honorable work. It may be lowly, in other words, work that men don't seem to be as high of a job, but let it be in keeping with the Spirit of Christ. And so what we're talking about here is the types of jobs that we are to do. Can a Christian just have any job? Honesty, we must remember, is to govern all of our activities. Let's go to Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3, verses 12 to 14. Now, you don't have your Bible with you, right? Oh, okay. So you want to go to Luke chapter 3, Bill. Just remember to speak up a little bit and get verses 12 to 14.
And some tax collectors also came to be baptized, and they said to him, Teacher, what shall we do? And he said to them, Collect no more than what you have been ordered to. Some soldiers were questioning him, saying, And what about us? What shall we do? And he said to them, Do not take money from anyone by force, or accuse anyone falsely, and be content with your wages.
All right, so Jesus is talking to some tax collectors who came to be baptized, and they asked him, what shall we do? And obviously they were going to be baptized, but he was trying to teach them a lesson about the way that they're to walk. Tax collectors, what were those types of people considered to be in New Testament time? You got any ideas, Bill?
Well, no one liked them.
Why did no one like, besides the fact that they collected taxes, why did no one like them?
Well, sometimes they took more than they should have.
Yeah. We take, when we do our taxes, tax season is coming up, although our government, I think, has extended the filing deadlines because of the COVID-19 thing. But when we do our taxes, we typically fill out the forms that the government gives us. We calculate our own taxes, and then the government will check our math and check our work and say, well, yes, we agree with that, or no, we don't agree with that. That's not how taxes were collected in New Testament times. You owed tax, and the tax collector physically came and collected the tax. And whatever the tax collector said you owed, and you needed to pay. And so sometimes there would be tax collectors that would take more than what they were owed, or what the government was owed. Now remember, they were paid for doing this. This was not like a tip that we put on some of our fast food deliveries where it is added on to the wages. That's not, the tax collectors were paid. It's just that they were stealing. And so Jesus said, collect no more than what is appointed to you, and be content with your wages. I don't know how well tax collectors were paid, but it might not have been that much. The government might not have paid them that much for what they did, and so they said, well, I want to live a little bit better, so I'm going to take more. And the people can't say anything, because if I report them back to the governor, they're going to go to jail. And so Jesus was telling them that they were to be honest. We are to be honest in our jobs. We aren't to take things from our boss, even though some people say, well, my boss won't miss it. Or this company is a multi-million-dollar company. They're not going to miss a computer that's missing. They can afford it. They'll just write it off. That's not how we're to behave. We are to act honestly in all things. And we are to work honestly for what we receive. Another point we should know is that, unless you had something, Bill.
I wondered if compassion
Yeah.
came into that, the thought of by force.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we're to have compassion on people, and that would certainly go into not taking more. If you had a poor person who owed X dollars or X amount of silver or whatever, and you took more from them, then you were impoverishing them to enrich yourself. And of course, yeah, we're to have compassion on others as well. And sometimes that might mean giving up something that we're owed, or that we think we're owed. There's a lot of people who are very wealthy right now who are giving up some of their salary and donating it to people who have been affected by this. And that's something they didn't have to do, but compassion might have led them to do that. Another point we need to know is that we should be employed in work that would reflect one's life as a Christian and the church of God. Let's go to 1 Corinthians. I'm going to get this. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to get verse 12. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 12. If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Paul is talking about here as far as being paid by the gospel. And he preaches the gospel of Christ. And so he is able to be paid by those whom he works with. Churches that he works with. The church in Corinth, as we're going to find out in our study of Corinth, there seemed to be teachers among them that were bad-mouthing Paul, saying that Paul either wasn't an apostle or he wasn't the teacher that they needed. And therefore, they didn't need to, if he came to help them, they didn't need to help Paul in regards to his teaching or as far as his wages. Remember, in Corinth, he worked with Aquila and Priscilla as tent makers because the church at Corinth wasn't supporting him. And so Paul was saying here, he was doing honorable work. I forgot to read the rest of the verse. Nevertheless, we have not used this right, endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. And that last part is important. Whatever our job is, it shouldn't hinder the gospel of Christ. And I think sometimes we as Christians don't consider that when we get a job. The first thing we look to, what is usually the first thing we look to when considering what job to get?
Sometimes wages.
Yeah. A lot of times people, when they take a look at a job, the wanted pages and on the internet or on in the newspapers, the first thing they're going to look at is how much does it pay? I may be qualified for it, but how much does it pay? If I'm qualified for it but doesn't pay a lot, now I'm not going to apply. Whereas we don't consider maybe a lot, how is this going to affect my spiritual life? Are the hours going to be too long? And if the hours are going to be too long where I won't have enough time to raise my family, I won't have enough time to raise my children, won't have enough time to worship God, won't have enough time to assist the church in ways that may be needed to be done. I have no time and no extra time. That might be a job we need to consider not taking. Might pay well. We might have to take a job that doesn't pay as well, but one that does allow those things. And so Christians should be asking themselves these questions. We must remember that what the world will approve is not necessarily the standard of Christ's teaching. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5 at verse 47. Matthew 5, verse 47. Bill, you want to get that?
Okay. If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same?
All right. I'm looking at a principle here. It's not teaching about work in this passage, but it is teaching that if we only do what the Gentiles do, if we only do what the world does, are we really walking after Christ? If the world doesn't know that we're Christians, if our coworkers has no idea, they come like, well, I would have never guessed that you were a Christian. What does that say about the example we're leading? It doesn't mean we just go around saying, I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian. Have you heard that I'm a Christian? But people should know. They should recognize in our speech that we don't talk like the world talks. They should know in our morals that we don't act like the world acts. People say, well, you want to go to the bar? Grab a beer after work. No, I don't do that. Why don't you do that? Well, because I'm a Christian and I don't participate in those things. Or do you want to go to the club after and behave in ways that we shouldn't behave in? No, I don't do that either. And we should be able to teach our coworkers, even if they won't respond, at least they know that we don't behave like they do. And maybe that will open some doors to some studies. But just because the world approves of something doesn't mean God approves of something. And so we need to consider that when we're going to work. And regarding work, we need to ask ourselves a couple questions. Is my work ever questioned as incompatible with Christ's teaching? In other words, do you think that Jesus would do the same type of work and be in that environment? Now, we can't always answer hypothetical questions, and we need to be careful with asking hypothetical. Well, what would Jesus do? And people often ask, what would Jesus do? Well, I can't say exactly what Jesus would do, but I do know that there are situations Jesus wouldn't put himself in. People often looked at, well, Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, but he didn't participate in their sins. And when he did so, they were the ones who wanted to hear what he had to say. He didn't go to the bar and just eat it up and drink it up with tax collectors and sinners. He didn't participate in their sin. He used the opportunity to teach, and they were the ones who wanted to hear the gospel. Whereas he didn't go and stand where the prostitutes were and just hobnob with the prostitutes. He didn't do that. We don't read of him doing that, even though we know that some prostitutes came to him seeking the gospel. And so when it comes to our job, should we be putting ourselves in situations where we know it goes directly against Christ's teaching? And the answer to that is no. We shouldn't be putting ourselves in positions of jobs that is incompatible with Christ's teaching. If I know that the Bible teaches I'm not to lie, I can't take a job in which the main feature of that is lying. Sometimes a salesman's job. There's nothing wrong with being a salesman necessarily. But sometimes car salesmen especially are told to lie about this or that. If we're going to be a car salesman, we can't lie. Lawyers are often known for lying, and politicians especially. The joke always is, when does a politician lie? When does he open his mouth? That being a politician isn't necessarily bad, but we have to have a higher standard. If we're a lawyer, we can't lie. If we're a politician, we can't lie. If we're anything, we can't lie. And if the main feature of that job is of necessity lying, then we know that's incompatible with Christ's teaching, and we shouldn't take a job like that. Another question we should ask: would I use the product I sell or provide? And by this, I'm talking about being like a bartender. If some people say, well, being drunk is bad, and I point out from 1 Peter chapter 4 that drinking in all stages are condemned in that passage, but we just have to know what those words mean. But even if drunkenness was the only thing that was condemned, would that be okay for us to serve alcohol to people we know who will get drunk? The answer is no. If we won't use the product, why would we have a job for it? Sometimes you see on television commercials with advertisements where they use famous television actors or actresses and movie stars to promote a product. And you'll sometimes see at the bottom, this is the person's been paid to do this. You have to ask yourself the question: if the person's paid to do this, would they use the product themselves? And sometimes I see some products where the actor or actress looks into the camera and says, I wouldn't recommend this product if I didn't believe in this company. And you can know that person actually does use the product that they're selling. But if we're in a situation where whatever we're selling would lead to sin, but we wouldn't participate in ourselves, but we would help we would cause someone else to do that, no, we shouldn't partake in that. Yeah, Bill.
I just thought, really, with our understanding of God, that we should feel shame. Like our conscience should move us and help direct us that, no, this isn't right.
Yeah.
For us to be in.
Yeah.
You know.
Absolutely. Which brings us to our next question: is our conscience pure in what we do? And let's get Romans 14 verse 23. Romans 14 verse 23. That's it. You want to get that, Bill? My tablet crashed. Yeah, verse 23, please.
But he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith, and whatever is not from faith is sin.
He who doubts is condemned if he eats. So in other words, if we doubt something is right and do it anyway, it's sin. That does not mean that whatever we have done is necessarily sinful. It does not mean that my conscience is what defines sin. But I should know from Scripture that something is right. And if I can't know that something is right, if it is impossible for me to know because God has not spoken, I shouldn't participate in it. If it is possible for me to know, but I really haven't studied enough, then it's something I should not do. There are some basic things that we know is right. And let's stick to those we know is right and study about those things that we are unsure of. And there are some, what I'll call, marginal things in life where people come along and say they're unsure of. This present distress has led a lot of people into a lot of questions, especially around the Lord's Supper. And those questions are good to ask and to study about, even in this time of present distress. And so that we can know what the truth is. The reason that this congregation over our live stream, where Bill and I, or whoever's here and I, partake of the Lord's Supper, is because this church is meeting. It's Bill and I. What people do at home, that is up to their conscience. Some people will partake of the Lord's Supper, some people will not. But we can all remember Jesus, whether we partake of the bread and the fruit of the vine, or whether we don't. And some people's conscience says, no, I am meeting live with the church at East End, therefore I am together with them, and I will eat of the Lord's Supper. And some people say, no, I'm not with them, and so I won't do that. It's their conscience that recognizes 1 Corinthians 11 does teach that the Lord's Supper is partaken when the church comes together. If someone was unable to be with me on Sunday, I wouldn't partake of the Lord's Supper the same way. We might have a time where we remember Jesus, but the church is not meeting if it's just me. And so when it comes to work, our conscience, we need to say, is this something I can do in good conscience? Is this product something I can sell in good conscience? Or do I know that there's too much wrong with this product that is going to cause some problems? So in other words, maybe I'm in pharmaceuticals, and my company is selling some drug that's supposed to heal something, but the side effects for it are something awful. Like some products have mild side effects, and some are going to cause heart attacks, strokes, and everything else that goes with it. And so, if I know all of these things, can I in good conscience go out and sell this product? And the answer to that is no, I can't do that. So we need to ask our conscience, would I want my son or daughter doing what I'm doing? We should ask that question. Because oftentimes, if it's an honorable job, it becomes the family business. Police officers often become their children sometimes will become police officers because dad or mom was a police officer. Firefighters, the same thing. Lawyers, doctors, professions, and even preachers sometimes runs in the family. But if you have a job and you say, I wouldn't want my son or daughter doing this job because of the things that it does. Some people don't want their son or daughter to do the job because they think it's too hard, or they don't want them to have the type of job. They maybe want them to have a better job. But if our job's sleazy enough, where you come like, I don't want my son or daughter doing what I'm doing, that's something we need to consider. Would I be content to be doing such when Christ comes? And I might even add, if I were to die right then. So in other words, if Christ comes and I'm going to have to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, would I be content with doing so and facing Christ in the judgment? And if I'm not comfortable doing that, then that's something I need to consider changing. Because if there's something that I'm doing that I think is going to keep me out of heaven, I need to change that. That's just pure and simple. And so we should be employed in work that reflects one's life as a Christian. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 20 says, let every man abide in the same calling in which we were called. And so a lot of people come along and say, well, I was a bartender before I became a Christian, so I'm going to remain a bartender. Or I was a casino blackjack dealer before I became a Christian, and so I'm going to remain a casino blackjack dealer. But again, we grab this verse straight out of context. It does not justify a man or a woman remaining in sinful work. The passage is referring to relationships or relations that are accepted in the gospel. Specifically, circumcision and uncircumcision are examples in that text. Being a Jew or a Gentile, you could be both and serve Christ. You couldn't bind the Gentile to become a Jew, nor could the Gentile bind the Jew to become a Gentile. They both could be Christians together. But the Christian is to sever themselves from unholy alliances. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Bill, you want to get 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 to 17.
not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Or what harmony has Christ with Belial? Or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? Or what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, just as God said, I will dwell in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean, and I will welcome you.
All right. This passage is often used to teach about marriage, even though the passage has nothing to do with marriage in in this context. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. That does not mean we cannot have a secular job, but we shouldn't become unequally yoked to the unbeliever. In other words, we shouldn't become what the unbeliever is. We shouldn't be going off into unbelief. And specifically in this context, it's talking about idol worship. You can't do both. You can't work in the idol temple, or you can't eat in the idol temple. You can't, and then go and be a Christian. You can't do that. You're being unequally yoked with unbelievers. We are to sever our unholy alliances, should we have them. By faith, we can forsake the wrong and do the right. Moses. What did Moses do when it came to how he chose to live his life? Do you remember from Hebrews chapter 11? Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. And we're going to be down, I think it's around verse 24. It's about verse 24 and verse 26. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Moses is an example of giving up the things of this world for serving God. And Moses could have remained in Pharaoh's family. He might have even become Pharaoh himself. I don't know. I don't know. There are some people who speculated, had Moses remained in the good graces of the Pharaoh at the time and not killed that Egyptian, which caused him to have to flee, would he have become Pharaoh? I do not know. But he would have been powerful in Pharaoh's family, regardless of whether or not he became Pharaoh himself. He could have enjoyed the pleasures of sin. But notice those were for a season, for a time. They weren't going to be forever. Moses looked to a better reward, a rewarding God, and he forsook all that came about. In Hebrews chapter 13, Bill, you want to get verse 5. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5.
Make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you.
Let your conduct be without covetousness. Sever relationships that are going to lead us into sin. Well, that can be friendships too. Friendships, we come along and we say, well, I have all these friends and they've been friends with me forever. And there's nothing wrong with having friends even if they're not Christians, because your example might lead them to Christ. You never know. But if your friends are always tempting you to sin, if they're going to drag you out and take you to places that Christians should not go, we need to get different friends. We need to get different friends because we should avoid temptation. If our job is going to lead us to sin, we need to get a better job. We need to get a different job. Might not be a better job. It's a different job, though. And the scriptures teach that we are not to do work that is going to bring shame to Christ, shame to the church, or ruin our testimony among the world. If we're going to bring someone to Christ, how are we going to do that? Well, it might start, and usually does, through our example. If someone looks at you and says, I don't want to be a Christian, if that's how Christians act, I don't want to be like that. What are we doing that causes that reaction? Is it something we're saying? Is it something we're doing? Or is it who we are? Our character, yes, we will have flaws, and yes, we will do some things that are wrong. We will sin. We're not going to be perfect. But that those who see us should know that we're not trying to act like that. And we might have a moment where we don't do what we're supposed to do, but on the whole, our reputation is that person can be trusted, that person works hard, that person does this. Why? Because they're a Christian. And so, coming down to point 3, the Christian is to deem secular work important, but never as important as good works of a spiritual life. Let's go to John chapter 6. John chapter 6 and verse 37. It's my turn to read. John chapter 6, verse 37. All that the Father gives me will come. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. Notice Jesus is talking about coming to him. Nothing else is mentioned in that. We need to come to Christ. If we come to Christ, what does Christ say he will not do? He will not cast out. If we come to him, is it important that I have a good job in this earth that makes a lot of money? Is that important?
Not really.
No. Is it important that I come to Christ? Absolutely. And so we need to have perspective as to which is more important. Bill, you want to get Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 and 20.
Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal.
You want to just get the next verse?
21?
Yeah.
For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Jesus is not saying in this passage it's wrong to be rich. But that last part's important. Where your treasure is, your heart will be. If all of our life is focused on getting rich, if that's all we care about, that's where our heart is. It's here on this earth. What can happen with treasures on this earth? They can be lost. People are finding that out every day over the last month. Forget how many millions of people Canada reported as going on unemployment, that were not expecting to lose their jobs when New Year's came for 2020. And they weren't expecting to lose their jobs when March 1st came of 2020. But they lost their jobs, even hopefully temporarily and not permanently, because of this. Well, what are those families going to do? They're going to find out that they have to live on less. And they might lose some things that they had in order to live. Well, that's what can happen to the things on this earth. If we are a Christian, we can be content with what we have, even if it is little, because our treasures are stored up in heaven. Moth or rust or thieves aren't going to come and steal our treasures in heaven, because they're spiritual treasures. And I'm not talking about, we're going to get so much gold in heaven or so much silver in heaven. That's not the treasures we're laying up in heaven. But we are to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. We should not permit our secular work to enslave us, where the time cannot be given to God at all. A lot of people have a problem with this. They work so much that they have no time for God. They're always coming out and why weren't you at worship this week? Well, I had to work. Okay, 1 week, maybe even 2 weeks. That might happen. But if it's always every Sunday you have to work, then you need to ask yourself, am I really giving time for God? If I'm working 14 hours a day, and I get home, and I go to bed, and I get up and go to work, and I go home and go to bed, like as far as, and all we're doing is working, and we have no time for God, then are we really, is our heart really on Christ, or is it on this world? Again, I'm not saying it's wrong to work. This lesson is on work, but it's putting work in the right place. Christians are Christ's workmanship, according to Ephesians 2, verse 10. We are to maintain good works that are necessary for use. Remember, faith without works is dead. It's not saying faith without a secular job is dead. Faith without doing what Christ has told us to do is dead. Are we loving our neighbor as ourselves? Those are good works. Are we building one fellow Christians up with love and good works, according to Hebrews chapter 10? Are we doing that? If we're not, if we don't have time to, you gotta be kidding me. If we don't have time to do that, then we have a problem. If we don't have time to worship on Sunday, we have a problem. If we don't have time to study, we have a problem. And so a Christian can abuse our work and make an idol out of it. If it controls our life, we have no time for God, even though we might be providing for our family. Providing for our family does not necessitate ruling out God. It just doesn't. Yes, the scriptures teach us we are to work for our food, we are to provide for our family. But we have to ask ourselves, are we providing for the needs of our family, or are we providing for the wants of our family? There's a difference between the two. I need to have food to eat. I need to have shelter over my head. I need to have clothes to wear, but not all the new style of clothing. I need to have clothes to wear. I might, in order to work, I might need a car. And I might need a cell phone in this day and age. But I don't need every gadget that comes out that Apple wants to sell, or Microsoft, or Google, or I don't need any of that in order to be a Christian. Now, sometimes I might be able to afford that, but I don't need that. And so, if all I'm working for is to get the brand new stuff that comes out, but I have no time for God, that's a problem. And so, let us use discernment in our work. Work is an honorable calling, but never permit our business of making a living engulf our spiritual life and our work. It can do that if you let it.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to